Hi, I'm James McGuire, and on today's eSpeaks, we're talking about unstructured data, meaning data that is not organized in a predefined manner. There's enormous value to this data, but handling it presents big challenges. To discuss that, I'm joined by a major industry expert. With me is Krishna Subramanian, President and Chief Operating Officer at Komprise. Krishna, happy Friday to you, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, James.
You know, I think it's amazing that unstructured data is a big topic these days. You wouldn't think something humble like unstructured data would be so popular and the kind of thing that so many people are talking about and so many people are spending a lot of money on. But really, unstructured data is a very hip topic these days. I'd like to get a sense of, just to clarify, what is unstructured data as opposed to structured data. And then there's also something called semi-structured data, just to make it all complicated. Could you give us the short 101 rundown on that?
Absolutely. If you think about it, if you go to a store and you buy something, there's a transaction and you know what the price is, what product you bought, how much of it you bought, and all of that usually goes into a database. That's what we would think of as structured data. So data is neatly organized in rows and columns, and typically it is in a database. If you went 20 years ago, most of our data was structured because we basically had tools to do, point of sale processing and then customer relationship management, and all of this data can be tabular, right? But the world has changed. And today, 85% of the data we generate is not in an easy database format. It's a genomics file, or it's your self-driving car data, or it's speech. This call might be recorded and a bot might have to analyze it. And all of this data is what we call unstructured because it does not actually have a specific tabular format.
Can I ask a question about that? I totally get that idea. You would think something like speech, though, in a chunk of text could be fairly easily digested by an analytics program, but I guess the answer is no. It could still struggle with that.
It's not so much that an analytics program cannot digest it. It's that it has to be specific to the type of data. So I think sometimes unstructured might be a bit of a misnomer because it's not that the data doesn't have structure. It doesn't have a common structure.
Yes.
So you may have a bunch of audio files, video files, genomics data, imaging files, and self-driving car data, and they don't share a common format, but within each, like maybe particular type of audio files, you could have something that processes that because there is a common format within it. But when we say unstructured, we mean across all of them, there isn't a common format. And you asked, what is semi-structured data? Well, semi-structured data is just like an Excel spreadsheet. So it's data that's still tabular, but it's not sitting in a database. So semi-structured data, it came about largely during the Hadoop and big data revolution because people said, well, we don't need to put everything into a SQL database. What if we created Python scripts? And what if we created something called JSON, which would be like a CSV file, but with a little bit more structure? So that's all it is. So unstructured and semi-structured data both can be broadly thought of as tabular data. And structured and semi-structured. And unstructured is data that isn't in a clean table. It's the bulk of the data today is unstructured. And that's why it's becoming a bigger and bigger issue, managing unstructured data.
And correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like unstructured data has enormous value because it's things like sentiment on a social media platform. There's comments, there's photos, and if, say, a certain retailer wants to know what the customers are saying about them on social media, that's not structured data, it's unstructured data, but it's really important to that retailer's image.
Yes, unstructured data, if you think about our evolution, we do a pretty good job today of analyzing structured data. So you could go to a company and you could say, well, who are your most profitable customers? Or, what is your average inventory time? And people will know the answers to these questions because they probably have a data warehouse and they're probably analyzing their structured data. But if you ask them, hey, of all the imaging files that you get, how often is it, cancer of this type? Or, if you ask them, hey, can you analyze your customer audio sentiment audio recordings and figure out where, how often are people unhappy because the wait time was too long? They can't answer those questions because we have not gotten to the point where we can systematically get visibility into unstructured data. Mobility of unstructured data, moving unstructured data around is very hard. And then realizing value from unstructured data. So visibility, mobility, value, I think are like the three big problems around managing unstructured data that we are facing today.
Great. Okay, I totally understand that, and thank you for the education. All right, so I think there's many companies out there struggling and wondering, we've got all this unstructured data. We know there's enormous value in it. What can we do to get more value from our unstructured data? How can we make it easier? So in particular, what about enabling unstructured data analytics?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, so one of the things with unstructured data, and James, you could probably relate to this even at a personal level. You probably have a mobile phone. You might take photos and videos on that phone. Your
Yes.
family is probably taking pictures in their phones. And then you probably have a computer where you have certain documents kept. You might have some things in a photo sharing site on the web. You have silos of unstructured data in your own personal life, right? And now multiply this by 20,000 employees and think about a company, an enterprise, right? And then say that that enterprise has been in business for 20 plus years. And you can just imagine how much unstructured data they've accumulated and how it's trapped in so many silos. And so, to get value from unstructured data, the first thing you need is to find a way to look across all those silos, whether it's in the cloud or in your data centers or in the edge. How can you get a view of all the unstructured data that you have? How can you know what employees have created and what's of value and what's not of value? How can you index all that data? And then how can you easily search across it? How can you optimize the cost of it? Because actually unstructured data, is growing rapidly, and managing its cost is another big concern. And then how can you search and find the right data to feed your machine learning program or your data lake or data warehouse? So all of that starts with visibility. And the key is to not get locked in at the infrastructure layer, because historically the idea has been, well, I'll put unstructured data into the storage platform and this storage platform will manage it for me. And that no longer works because you have so many storage platforms, you have so many clouds. Even within a cloud, you have 16 to 20 different classes and tiers of storage. So the problem today is that you're trapped in silos. And so you have to go above the silos to a data layer, and you have to get a view of your data, not of your silos, and then manage the data.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. So I want to ask you about Komprise and the Komprise solution, which I know does handle unstructured data. But even before we get to that, if you look at the market in a larger sense, aren't there many companies rushing to handle the idea of unstructured data? I think, and part two of that question is part of the problem that some of the clouds are focused on their own platform? Azure is focused on Azure, AWS is focused on AWS. Is that part of the problem or not necessarily?
I think there is innovation at many layers, and all of that innovation, in my opinion, is required. It is not a problem that can only be solved at one level. So definitely at the infrastructure level, whether you're a storage vendor or a cloud vendor, they're all trying to solve the problem of how do we store unstructured data more efficiently? How do we make it easy for customers? Just like, you yourself, you have a kitchen and you have a living room and you have a bedroom, because at different times you want to do different things. Data is exactly like that. Data has a life cycle. Sometimes data needs the fastest processing that's available because it's active. Sometimes it's dormant and it's going to sit around. 80% of your data is going to be cold data and it needs to be on cheaper storage. Sometimes you need to process it in a data lake and you need to be able to get the metadata easily out of it. So data has different needs, and the cloud providers are focused on how do we satisfy those different needs from an infrastructure perspective? People like Komprise, we're focused on the data management. How do we bridge across all this infrastructure? How do we give you a view of your data? How do we move the right data to the right place? And how do we feed your data analytics? That's what we're focused on. Vendors like Snowflake and Databricks are focused on how do we analyze the data once we get it? And all of these are required, in my opinion. I mean, you need that entire spectrum.
Yeah, I guess I'm seeing, in a sense, three different classes of vendors. There's, of course, yourself and whoever competes with you. You're managing the data. There are people who really focus on storing the data, yes. And there are people who focus on analyzing the data, like the Snowflakes and Databricks of the world.
Yes.
Is that an accurate way to think about the three worlds?
Yes, I think that's a great way to think about it. There's the infrastructure and storage. There's the data management, which is kind of like an independent layer that bridges infrastructure. And then there's the application layer, which not only does analytics, but there's also applications that use unstructured data. For example, we have a lot of pharmaceutical customers, and they want to do certain kinds of like microscopic genomic analysis in the cloud, where the cloud is a perfect medium to do that because you can spin up capacity very easily. But somebody has to bring the right data to that microscopic, genomics software, right? Somebody has to say, this is the right data that goes in there. And when it's done, take that data out and delete it. So that's the data management piece. But yeah, processing is the third part. Yeah.
Well, and it seems, I've always wondered why, some of the larger vendors wouldn't try to get into all three of those worlds. I'm sure there are some of the large names, household technology names that we know, that are attempting to handle analytics and management and storage and infrastructure. There are vendors who would do all three of those, correct?
I mean, maybe today, I don't think there's anybody that's doing all three really well because they're all very big problems.
Right.
And you have to focus on something to solve it well. I mean, over time, could they all consolidate? Perhaps. But the one thing we all know in the technology industry is there has never, ever been a one size fits all, particularly when it comes to data, because the market keeps evolving and our needs keep evolving. Just to give you an idea, data is growing. Unstructured data is already 85% of our total footprint, and it's growing at 30% plus year over year.
Wow.
So the problems we're solving today are not the problems of tomorrow. So you're going to have to keep innovating at all layers of the stack. And can one person do it all? Possibly, but it's a pretty daunting task.
Mm-hmm. So you've talked about Komprise a little bit. I want to make sure I get the full story on Komprise. Is there a use case or anything else about how Komprise manages unstructured data?
Yeah, most of our customers are on a transformation. So they're enterprises that have a lot of unstructured data. They know their data is growing, and many of them are transforming to the cloud, as an example. And they use us to understand what data they have, to save on costs. Usually they save 70% plus of costs as we mobilize their data into the cloud, and then to feed their analytics and machine learning so that they can generate money from their data. They can monetize their data. Yeah, so that's what Komprise does. We do unstructured data management, and we work across the different storage and infrastructure and cloud players, as well as the Snowflakes and Databricks of this world. We focus more on the data management.
Well, let's talk about the future of managing unstructured data. Will there come a time when managing unstructured data is as easy as managing structured data? It'd be really streamlined, or is that unlikely in the near to medium term future?
Our goal is to make the basics of managing unstructured data as easy as possible. It shouldn't be so difficult when you're spending 35% of your IT budget on storing unstructured data. It shouldn't be so difficult to ask an IT person, well, what kinds of unstructured data do you have? Why is it growing at this rate? And they don't know the answer. It shouldn't be that difficult, right? But it is today because everything is trapped in silos. It shouldn't be difficult that you want to go from one layer in a cloud to another layer, or you want to even switch your cloud vendor. So the basics of managing unstructured data, the blocking and tackling should become simpler and simpler and simpler, so you can focus on the high value items. What machine learning do you really want to enable? How do you make that machine learning even smarter? How can you do more with your data? That's where we want people focused on, and the tools should handle everything else.
Fascinating. So anything else in terms of the future of unstructured data? Say we're in the middle of this decade, 2025, 2026. What will the management of unstructured data look like in that not so distant date?
Well, there's I think a rather controversial topic that we have not talked much about, and that comes to deleting data. I mean, often I think we're all hoarders by nature, and we
Yes.
don't like to delete anything.
Right.
But the staggering pace of data growth means you have to become more efficient. I mean, even look at the environment, right? There is kind of an aspect where we must only keep what we really need, and we must get better at extracting the value from what we need, and perhaps deleting things that we do not need. And I think there is a big role that data management plays in sort of the whole green IT revolution. And confining and deleting data is a part of that. And I think in the future, you will see more innovation from companies on that front.
Well, I guess many companies would answer your thought by saying, "Oh no, we don't want to delete. We'll just put it on cheaper and cheaper formats."
Yeah.
As you know, the cloud players have their low end storage. I'm sure someone's still selling tape systems out there. And then I think the company will say, "We don't want to delete. We'll just put it on really cheap storage." What would you say to that?
Yes, I mean, definitely deletion is not an instantaneous thing. I mean, you want to, we are fans of tiering and lifecycle management. Yes, you want to move data to cheaper tiers, but at some point it is obsolete. And at some point you may be able to keep what's most valuable about the data without keeping all of the data. And this is particularly going to become true for edge data, because there's so much data that is going to get generated at the edge. You cannot possibly keep all of it. And so the notion of extraction and kind of a staged deletion, not an immediate deletion, but a life cycle that ends with confining the data somehow and then deleting, I believe is going to become important.
I think it almost physically must. We think about specifically about the edge and IoT. There's a torrent of data happening constantly, and there's an exponential growth in IoT devices. So by definition, we can't store it all. But
Yes.
will the deletion come down to a date, a certain amount of age to the data? What will make it deletable?
Well, I mean, data is just, some data that just gets obsolete. So you may have ex-employee data that you've been keeping around for 20 plus years, and really nobody even knows what's in it, and maybe there's absolutely no value, or data that is no longer legally, you don't even want to keep it because it creates a legal liability. And today it's just very hard to identify this kind of data. These are the obvious things, data that's redundant or obsolete, is easy to identify if you identify it correctly. And then if you can confine it, in Komprise, we have a feature called confine, where we take that data, we don't delete it, we move it to a place that users cannot see it anymore and applications cannot see it. And the reason we do that is so that you can actually verify that nobody is missing this data. And then you can delete it, when you're ready for it. You can even say, move it to this place, confine it, and after a year, delete it if nobody missed it, right? So it's things like that where you can be more responsible with how you manage data. Also, maybe some of the edge data, we can pull out the index from the data, and you don't need all the data points if you can have a concise index. And maybe then you can delete the raw data because you have a processed form of that data. This is very true in areas like genomics, where they have interim files and then they have the final file, and the interim files are raw data and can be deleted after a certain point in time because you actually have the final format, which is much more condensed. So it's really, that kind of data, transient data, obsolete data, trivial data, redundant data. There is no good way today to identify this data. And, to your point, just bluntly deleting it may not be the right answer. You need a staged, methodical approach to getting there.
I'm thinking there may be a new category of startups. So we know the sector, there's management of data, there's analytics of data, there's storage and infrastructure. Perhaps there'd be a data startup called deletion, and their specialty is deleting data. Like what do you do? We delete data. Do you see that startup ever happen? Or, Krishna, do you think you will start that startup?
Well, Comprise actually does it. I mean, we do think of confine and delete as part of data management. Data management is about the whole life cycle of data, including the end of life of that data. And so we do handle all of it.
Good to know. Good to know. Krishna, I think you said it. It's fascinating stuff. Data is really the area, definitely. Thank you so much for sharing your insight today.
Thank you, James. As always, it was a pleasure.